Prologue. The day Charles Xavier died, the sky over Genosha turned the color of a bruise. Later, people would argue about what they had seen. Some said the clouds had gathered without warning, a sudden darkness that swallowed the afternoon and held it hostage for 3 hours before releasing the sun as if nothing had happened. Others insisted the sky had always been that color, that the light in the late afternoon had always carried that particular shade of purple-gray, and they had simply never noticed until the day that everything changed. A few claimed there had been no clouds at all, only a stillness so profound that the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something it could not name. Erik Lehnsherr did not care what they remembered. He was not interested in their interpretations of a moment that belonged to him alone. He stood in the courtyard where it had happened, where it was still happening, in the sense that Charles's body had not yet been moved and the blood had not yet dried, and the guards who had witnessed it had not yet recovered enough to do anything except stand where they stood and look at what they were looking at. The courtyard was circular, bordered by columns of white stone that had been carved by artisans whose names were lost to history, and at its center, on a flagstone that had been polished by centuries of footsteps, Charles Xavier lay with his eyes open and his hands at his sides as if he had simply decided to stop. He had not decided to stop. He had been stopped, but the distinction felt less important now than it had an hour ago, when Erik had still been capable of feeling the full weight of what he had done. The blood had spread in a pattern that Erik recognized. He had seen enough blood in his life to know its shapes, the way it moved across stone and soil, the logic of its geography. Charles's blood had pooled beneath his head first, then trickled along the grain of the flagstones toward the drainage channel at the courtyard's edge, following a path that looked almost deliberate, as if even in death Charles was directing the flow of something he had spent his life trying to control. The pool was smaller than Erik expected. Head wounds bled dramatically. Charles had always been more restrained than the situation suggested. Erik looked at the body for a long time. He did not allow himself to feel what he felt. He had learned decades ago that feeling was a luxury he could not afford, that the moment he let himself feel the full measure of any single moment, that moment would consume him and leave nothing for the moments that followed. So he cataloged. Instead, the position of Charles's arms, the angle of his neck, the way his eyes, still open, still seeing, had turned toward the sky as if in the final instant he had wanted to see nothing except the heavens. Charles had been religious once, before the accident that had stolen the use of his legs and confined him to a chair for the rest of his life. He had spoken about God with a conviction that Erik had never shared, not because Erik didn't believe, but because belief seemed beside the point when you had already seen what human beings were capable of doing to each other in the name of a higher power. But Charles had believed. And in the end, lying on cold stone with a hole in his chest, perhaps he had returned to that belief. Perhaps the sky was the last thing he saw, and the sky was enough. Erik dismissed the thought. Sentimentality was poison. "Take him," he said. His voice was quiet, steady, carrying the authority that 3 decades of leadership had bred into it. "Give him a proper funeral. He deserves that much." No one answered. No one moved. The mutant soldiers who had fought beside him during the assault on Xavier's school stood in a loose semicircle at the courtyard's edge, their weapons lowered, their faces unreadable. They had been prepared for violence. They had trained for it, drilled for it, dreamed about it in the years when Magneto's war was still a possibility and not yet a reality. But they had not been prepared for this, for the silence that followed, for the body on the stone, for the man who had killed the most powerful telepath on Earth and then stood over him as if waiting for something to happen. Erik understood their hesitation. He had been waiting for something to happen too. "What are you waiting for?" he asked, not angry, curious. "He is dead. The war is over. There is nothing more to fear from Charles Xavier." Still no movement. The soldiers looked at each other, at Erik, at the body. None of them had known Xavier well. Most of them had encountered him only as a symbol, a name invoked in arguments about mutant rights, a figure who represented everything they had spent their lives opposing. But symbols had power, and the power did not die simply because the symbol had been brought down. They were afraid, Erik realized. not of Charles, of him. He did not know whether to be offended or satisfied. "I will not harm you," he said. "I never intended to harm any of you. You are mutants. You are my people. What happened here today was necessary, not because I wanted it, but because the alternative was unacceptable." Charles Xavier was a brilliant man and in his own way a good one. But his vision was a fantasy, and the world he wanted to build was built on sand. "I have built something stronger. I will protect it the way I have always protected the things I love." He paused. The word felt strange in his mouth, love. He had used it thousands of times in speeches and manifestos, in private conversations and public declarations. He had spoken of loving mutantkind, loving his children, loving the dream of a world where his people would never be hunted again. But the word had always been a vessel for something else. For conviction, for purpose, for the cold fire that had burned in him since the day he learned what human beings were capable of when they decided that a group of people did not deserve to exist. Love, Erik had always believed, was what you felt for things that could be lost. And Erik had lost so much that he had learned to protect himself by refusing to name the things he felt. He called them principles, causes, necessities. He did not call them love because love implied vulnerability, and Erik Lehnsherr had spent 80 years making himself invulnerable. But now, standing over the body of his oldest friend, he felt something that might have been lost. Not the sharp, immediate loss of a single death. He had experienced that too many times to feel it sharply anymore, but a deeper loss. The loss of a possibility that had existed for 60 years and was now gone. Charles had always represented something to Erik. Not just a man, but a version of the future that Erik might have chosen if he had been different, if his suffering had been less, if the boy who had survived Auschwitz had grown into someone capable of believing that another path was possible. That version of the future was dead. Charles was dead, and Erik was still standing, and the future that remained was the one he had chosen, the one he had fought for, bled for, sacrificed everything for. It was his now, all of it, the world and everything in it, every mutant and human and every system that kept them alive and ordered and safe from the persecution that had defined Erik's childhood. He had won. The thought should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt like a door closing, not with a slam but with a soft click, the sound of a lock engaging, the sound of a room becoming sealed. "Take him," Erik said again. "I will not ask a third time." The soldiers moved. They lifted Charles's body with a care that surprised Erik, more care than they had shown for any of the X-Men who had fallen during the assault, more care than the situation technically required. Perhaps they understood, in some dim way, that what they were carrying was not just a body but a legacy. Perhaps they felt the weight of it the same way Erik did, not the physical weight, but the other kind. The kind that could not be measured or moved or buried. Erik watched them carry Charles out of the courtyard, through the archway, toward the transport that would take him to whatever end Erik decided to grant him. He watched until there was nothing left to watch, no body, no blood, no evidence that anything had happened at all except the flagstone that would need to be cleaned and the silence that would need to be filled. Then he turned away from the courtyard and walked toward his new home. The house had been Charles's. Erik had not chosen it for that reason. He had chosen it because it was structurally sound, defensible, positioned in a location that gave him strategic access to the territories he now controlled. But the irony was not lost on him. He had spent decades fighting Charles Xavier, arguing with him, trying to destroy everything he had built, and now he was living in his house, sleeping in his bed, looking out his windows at the view he had once looked at while planning his next assault. The study was on the second floor, at the end of a hallway lined with portraits of X-Men who had died in service to Charles's vision. Erik walked past them without looking. He knew the faces, had studied them during the planning stages of this very campaign, learning who was dangerous and who was merely inconvenient, who could be turned and who had to be eliminated. The dead looked down at him from their frames with expressions that ranged from heroic to tragic to simply tired, and Erik felt nothing for any of them. They had chosen their sides. They had made their stands. They had lost, and loss was its own answer. The study was exactly as Charles had left it. Erik had expected changes, had assumed when he took possession of the house, that the rooms would be empty, stripped of their former contents, cleared of any evidence that Charles Xavier had ever lived there. But someone, Mystique perhaps, or one of the lieutenants who had managed the transition, had left everything in place. The books on the shelves, the papers on the desk, the chair behind the desk, worn in the armrests from years of use. The window that looked out over the grounds, past the gardens and the training fields, toward the mountains that marked the edge of Magneto's new territory. And the portrait, Charles in his prime, before the accident, before the school, before everything that had defined him in the public imagination. He was smiling in the portrait, not the smile of a man who knew he would change the world, but the smile of a man who was simply glad to be alive, happy, hopeful. The kind of smile Erik remembered from his own childhood, from a time before he had learned what the world actually was. Erik stood in front of the portrait for a long time. He did not remove it. That was the strange thing, the thing he could not explain, even to himself. Every practical consideration argued for its removal. It was a reminder of an enemy. It was a symbol of a vision Erik had spent decades opposing. It was, in the most literal sense, an image of a man Erik had just killed. Removing it would be simple. A single gesture, a moment's work, and the study would be entirely Erik's. No ghosts, no echoes, no sense of being watched by eyes that belonged to the past. But he did not remove it. Instead, he stood there, looking at Charles's smile, and tried to remember the last time he had smiled like that. Not a performance smile, not the smile he used in negotiations or the smile he deployed in moments of crisis to reassure his followers that everything was under control. A real smile. The kind that came from somewhere genuine, somewhere underneath the survival instinct and the strategic calculation, and the decades of pain that had calcified into something that looked like purpose, but was actually just fear. He could not remember. The last genuine smile felt like something from another life, something that had happened to a different Erik, a boy who had not yet learned what the world was capable of, who had not yet watched his mother die in a camp, who had not yet understood that the only way to survive was to become something harder than the world that was trying to destroy you. That boy was gone. Erik did not mourn him. He had mourned enough in his life, and mourning was a luxury he could not afford. But standing in front of Charles's portrait, in the study of the man he had killed, he felt something that was almost like recognition. The boy who smiled like that was gone, but Charles had been that boy once. Charles had believed in hope and goodness and the fundamental decency of people, and those beliefs had sustained him through decades of failure, through the loss of his legs, through the constant war between his vision and Erik's nightmare. Charles had never stopped believing. That was his gift and his curse, the belief that never faltered, never dimmed, never acknowledged the possibility that Erik might be right. He had died still believing, still hoping, still certain that a better world was possible if only people were willing to work for it. Erik had killed him anyway. The thought should have been triumphant. Instead, it was quiet, a fact rather than a feeling. Erik had killed Charles because Charles represented a danger not to Erik personally, but to the world Erik was building. Charles's influence persisted even after his death. His students carried his ideas, his methods, his absolute conviction that another way was possible. As long as Charles's legacy survived, Erik's world was incomplete. The foundation was solid, but the structure remained vulnerable to the infection of hope. So Erik had removed the infection. Cut it out cleanly, the way you cut out a tumor necessary, even if the process was unpleasant. He had told himself this as he stood over the body. He had told himself this as he ordered the funeral. He had told himself this as he walked into the study and looked at the portrait and tried to remember what it felt like to believe in something without needing to destroy everyone who disagreed with it. He was not sure he believed himself. Night came slowly, the way it always did in late autumn, not a sudden darkness but a gradual dimming, a fade from gray to darker gray to black. Erik sat in Charles's chair, behind Charles's desk, and looked out Charles's window at the world he had conquered. The grounds below were quiet. The guards had been posted, the perimeter secured, the house sealed against intrusion. Everything was as it should be. The empire Magneto had spent decades building was now, finally, completely his, not a patchwork of territories and alliances and grudging accommodations, but a unified whole, a single structure with a single purpose and a single voice to give it direction. He should have felt triumph. He should have felt relief, satisfaction, the deep breath of a man who has finally set down a burden he has carried for so long he forgot what it felt like to stand without it. Instead, he felt the weight of it, the weight of everything. Charles was dead. The X-Men were scattered, leaderless, fighting among themselves over what to do now that their founder was gone. The human governments had surrendered, their armies disbanded or absorbed, their politicians either converted to the new order or removed from power entirely. The world was at peace, the kind of peace that Magneto had always promised, the kind that came not from understanding but from the simple, brutal fact of dominance. Mutants were safe, or safer. Erik had achieved what he set out to achieve, and if the cost was high, if the cost included Charles's body on a flagstone and the weight of billions of souls pressing against his awareness, and the slow, inexorable understanding that he had become the very thing he spent his life fighting, well, the cost was always high. That was the nature of survival. You paid what the moment demanded, and you did not ask whether the price was fair because fairness was a concept that belonged to people who had the luxury of thinking about it. Erik pressed his hand against the glass. His reflection stared back, older than he remembered, harder than he wanted to be. The lines on his face were the lines of a man who had lived too long and seen too much, who had buried too many people and killed too many enemies, and never once stopped to ask whether the path he was walking was the right one because asking would have meant stopping, and Erik Lehnsherr had never learned how to stop. His hand trembled. The tremor was new, or rather, the tremor was old, but he had only just noticed it. The first sign of something he could not name, a weakness in the machinery that had carried him through the last century. He closed his fist, forced the tremor to stop, and held his hand steady against the glass. Charles would have noticed. Charles would have said something about the importance of rest, of recovery, of giving the body what it needed before the body decided to take it anyway. Charles had always been concerned with the body's needs, with the physical reality of existence, the way the flesh insisted on its limitations even when the mind refused to acknowledge them. Erik had always dismissed those concerns. He had more important things to worry about than the body's complaints. He had a world to build, a people to protect, an empire to maintain. The body would hold as long as it was needed. If it failed, he would fix it. Science, technology, the accumulated knowledge of a century spent studying the intersection of mutation and medicine. He had access to resources that could extend his lifespan indefinitely, repair damage that would kill lesser beings, keep him functional long after the natural end of his years. But the tremor reminded him that resources were not infinite, that the body had its own agenda, its own timeline, its own demands that could not be permanently deferred. That someday, perhaps soon, perhaps in a decade, perhaps in a century, the machinery would fail and Erik Lehnsherr would be gone, and the world he had built would either survive him or collapse. The thought terrified him. He had never feared death. Death was a constant companion for someone who had survived the Holocaust and the wars that followed, someone who had spent decades in the crosshairs of governments and assassins, and the accumulated hostility of a world that did not want him to exist. Death was familiar, an old friend who knocked on the door every few years and reminded Erik that the appointment between them had not yet arrived. But this was different. This was not the death of Erik Lehnsherr. It was the death of what he had built, the death of the world that existed because he had refused to let it become something else, the death of the peace he had forced into existence through violence and will and the absolute conviction that he was right. He had not built this world so that it could die with him. He had built it so that it would last asterisk, so that the children of mutants would grow up in a universe where they were never hunted, never feared, never told that their existence was an aberration that needed to be corrected. He had built it so that the nightmare of his childhood would never recur, not in his lifetime or his children's lifetimes or any of the lifetimes that followed. But the tremor in his hand whispered a question he could not answer. What happened when the builder was gone? What happened when the man who held the structure together was no longer there to hold it? Who would carry the weight? Who would make the hard decisions? Who would be strong enough, certain enough, ruthless enough to maintain the peace that Erik had purchased with Charles's blood? No one. The answer was no one. Because Erik was singular, the product of a specific history, a specific trauma, a specific vision that could not be replicated or inherited or taught. He was irreplaceable, and irreplaceable things by their nature did not last. Erik removed his hand from the glass. The reflection dissolved, replaced by the dark window and the darker sky beyond. The stars were invisible light pollution, cloud cover, the simple fact that a city glowed where a garden had once stood. But Erik knew they were there. Billions of them, billions of worlds, billions of lives that were now part of his domain. He had conquered not just a planet but a universe of possibility, and the possibility was both his greatest achievement and his heaviest burden. He turned away from the window. The portrait of Charles watched him from the wall, still smiling, still hopeful, still believing in something that Erik had spent 60 years trying to destroy. The smile seemed different in the darkness, less cheerful, more knowing. As if Charles, even in pain, understood something Erik did not. As if the question Erik had been avoiding since the courtyard was written on Charles's face in the faint light of the moon. What happens now? Erik did not answer. He walked to the door, paused, and looked back at the study, at the books and papers and chair and portrait, at the room that had belonged to his enemy and was now his, at everything he had won and none of it had made him complete. Take care of this house, he said, to no one, to himself, to whatever ghost might be listening. It will need to last. He closed the door behind him. The portrait smiled in the darkness. The stars turned overhead. And in a bedroom that had once belonged to a dead man, Erik Lehnsherr lay down to sleep and dreamed of nothing at all, because the first night of victory was always the quietest, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound he had ever heard. Chapter 1: Order. 3 years had passed since the fall of Charles Xavier, and the world had learned to breathe differently. It was not a dramatic change, not the kind of shift that announced itself with fanfare or catastrophe. It was quieter than that, subtler, the kind of transformation that happened so gradually that no one noticed it happening until one day they looked around and realized that the world they were living in was not the world they had been born into. The change was in the air, in the way people, human and mutant alike, moved through their daily lives with a certain quality of attention, a heightened awareness of the space they occupied, and the people who occupied it with them. It was in the way conversations paused when certain topics arose, and resumed with a slightly different texture when the danger had passed. It was in the way children were taught, and the way adults were employed, and the way the architecture of power had been rearranged so quietly that most people only understood the new arrangement by living inside it. It was not that humanity suffered, not in the way Erik's enemies had predicted, in the breathless warnings that had circulated during the final days of the old order. There were no mass executions, no concentration camps, no systematic campaigns to erase the human race from the pages of history. Erik Lehnsherr had built something far more terrifying than a tyranny. He had built a preference. A gentle, persistent, inescapable hierarchy that placed mutants above humans in every institution, every opportunity, every doorway that led to power. Children born as mutants were celebrated. Birth certificates were filed, genetic markers recorded, futures mapped out with the quiet confidence of a society that knew exactly what it valued. Parents received government stipends for mutant births, not as incentives, but as acknowledgments, small recognitions that the continuation of mutantkind was the continuation of everything that mattered. Schools tracked mutant children with care, assigned them to accelerated programs, prepared them for leadership positions that would be waiting when they graduated. Children born as humans were tolerated. The language had been refined over decades of theoretical work, sharpened into something that sounded reasonable even when it wasn't. No law said humans are inferior, but every law said mutants are priority, in housing, in employment, in medical care, in the allocation of resources that determined who thrived and who merely survived. And in a world where those two things were functionally identical, no one dared to test the difference. The enforcement was soft. That was the key. Erik had studied the history of oppression, had read, in the camps, the accounts of systems that had tried to maintain dominance through terror, and discovered that terror was expensive, that it required constant vigilance and constant violence, and eventually collapsed under the weight of its own necessity. He had built something different, something that didn't need to announce itself, because it had become so embedded in the structure of daily life that questioning it felt like questioning gravity. Enforcers patrolled the streets in pairs, their electromagnetic badges humming softly at their hips, not weapons exactly, but reminders. Reminders of who was in charge. Reminders of what happened when the preference was challenged. The reminders were rarely needed. People knew. They had always known, perhaps, but had simply lacked the vocabulary to name what they knew. Now they had the vocabulary, and the vocabulary was law, and the law was everywhere and nowhere, and life went on in the spaces between the words. Erik Lehnsherr stood at the window of what had been Charles Xavier's study, and looked out at the city he had built. The study had become his by necessity, then by habit, then by something that felt almost like ownership, not because he had claimed it, but because the room had absorbed him the way rooms do when they become the center of a person's life. He woke in it, worked in it, slept in the bed that had been Charles's bed, ate meals at the table where Charles had once entertained world leaders and miscalculated the trajectory of human history. The portrait had been removed eventually, not in those first days, when sentimentality had kept it in place, but sometime in the second year, when Erik had finally understood that keeping it was a form of weakness he could not afford. He had replaced it with something he commissioned from a Genoshan artisan, a simple silver medallion, no larger than his palm, hung on a chain that matched the chain of his helmet. The medallion was inscribed with a single line, written in the old language he had learned as a boy in the camps. For those who came after. He wore it always. It hung against his chest beneath his shirt, where no one could see it but he could feel it, a small weight, a constant reminder, a promise he had made to himself and to everyone who had come before him and everyone who would come after. The promise was simple. The suffering would end. The persecution would stop. The children of mutants would grow up in a world that did not fear them. He had kept the promise. That was the part no one understood, not even his enemies, not even his allies, not even the voices that sometimes whispered to him in the quiet hours when sleep would not come. He had kept the promise, and the keeping had cost him everything, and now he stood in the window of a dead man's study and watched the sun rise over a world that existed because he had refused to let it become something else. The view had changed over 3 years. The grounds that had once been Xavier's estate had been expanded, restructured, integrated into the network of secure locations that Erik maintained across his territory. The gardens were still there. He had not destroyed them, had not seen the point in destroying something that was beautiful for the sake of beauty, but they were watched now. Enforcers patrolled the perimeter. Sensors lined the trees. The idol of the old school had become the fortress of the new order, and the flowers that had once bloomed for the pleasure of students now bloomed for an audience of guards. Erik did not mind. Beauty was beauty, and he had earned the right to enjoy it. The world was his, and everything in it was his, and the only thing that mattered was that it remain his, that the peace he had purchased with Charles's blood continue uninterrupted, generation after generation, until the memory of persecution was as distant as the memory of the Holocaust had become for the children of those who survived it. He was tired sometimes. The tiredness came in waves, not the exhaustion of a single battle or a single day, but something deeper, something that settled into his bones and stayed there, reminding him that he was not the machine he pretended to be. But tiredness was manageable. He had managed it for 80 years. He would manage it for 80 more if that was what the world required. The morning reports waited on his desk. He turned from the window, crossed the room, sat in the chair that had been Charles's chair. The papers were arranged in stacks, each stack representing a different sector of his domain, a different set of concerns that required his attention before the day could begin in earnest. Housing, education, security, infrastructure. the bureaucratic machinery of an empire that ran on the fuel of his will, and the labor of thousands of people who had learned, over 3 years, to operate within the parameters he had established. He picked up the first stack: housing. The numbers told a story he knew by heart. Mutant families received priority in all residential allocations. Human families received what remained after mutant needs were satisfied, and the gap between the two categories widened a little more each quarter. It was not policy, not officially. It was preference, tendency. The natural consequence of a system that valued one group over another, and trusted that the valuing would propagate through every layer of society without requiring explicit enforcement. Erik had learned in his decades of ruling that systems were more reliable than people. People could be corrupted, coerced, persuaded to change their loyalties. Systems could not. A system was a machine, and a machine did what it was designed to do, and Erik had designed his system to ensure that mutant interests came first in every context where interests could be prioritized. The system didn't need him to enforce the preference. It enforced itself, every day, in every transaction, in every decision made by every bureaucrat and planner and allocator who worked within its parameters. That was the genius of it. That was what Charles had never understood, what the XMen had never grasped, what the human governments had spent decades failing to comprehend. Power was not about what you could force people to do. Power was about what you could make people want to do, what you could embed so deeply in the structure of daily life that questioning it became unthinkable, and unthinkable things remained unquestioned. Erik set the housing reports aside, picked up the next stack: education. The numbers here were more complex, tracking not just allocations but outcomes, measuring the success rates of mutant students versus human students, monitoring the pipeline that fed mutant graduates into positions of authority across his domain. The numbers were exactly where he wanted them. Mutant students progressed faster, received better resources, were channeled into tracks that led to leadership positions. Human students were educated. Erik was not a monster, had never been a monster, had only ever been a survivor who understood that some forms of inequality were necessary, but they were educated for a different purpose: to fill roles, to serve, to accept the world as it was and prepare themselves to live within it. This was not cruelty. Erik had to believe that, had spent 3 years constructing the belief and reinforcing it every morning when he woke and every night when he lay down to sleep. This was survival. This was the lesson the Holocaust had taught him, the lesson that human history confirmed over and over again. Groups that were not protected would be persecuted, and the only way to ensure protection was to become so powerful that persecution was no longer possible. He had made mutants powerful. He had placed them at the top of every hierarchy, in every position of authority, in every role that determined how the world functioned. And in doing so, he had made persecution impossible, because the persecutors were no longer in charge. They were managed, tolerated, allowed to exist as long as they accepted the terms of existence that Erik had established. It was not a perfect solution. Erik knew that. No solution was perfect. But it was a solution that worked, that maintained order, that allowed millions of people, mutant and human alike, to live their lives without the constant fear that had defined existence before his ascension. It was a solution that Charles would have rejected, would have fought against with every ounce of his considerable intellect, would have died opposing if he had not already died at Erik's hand. But Charles was wrong. Charles had always been wrong, and his wrongness had cost Erik decades of unnecessary conflict. Decades of fighting against a man who could have been an ally if he had been willing to face the truth about human nature. The truth was simple. Humans would always fear what they did not understand. Mutants were, by their nature, not understood, not fully, not completely, not in a way that would allow the fear to dissipate over time. Education could not cure it. Goodwill could not cure it. The patient, noble work that Charles had devoted his life to could not cure it, because the disease was not ignorance. The disease was fear, and fear was rational, and the only cure for rational fear was irrational power, the kind of power that made fear irrelevant, that made the thing feared so strong that fearing it became absurd. Erik had made mutants that strong, and the world had survived the making. He set the education reports aside, picked up the final stack. Security. The reports here were shorter. He had cultivated subordinates who understood what required his attention and what did not, and most security matters fell into the latter category. But today's stack contained a folder that his assistant had marked with a small red symbol, the symbol that meant, "This requires your personal review." Erik opened the folder. Read the summary. Felt something shift in his chest, not alarm, not concern, but a familiar tightening, the sensation of a problem that had been managed for years and was now, for reasons he did not yet understand, beginning to slip. Human unrest in the Eastern Territories. The report said it was contained. The report said the cells were small, disorganized, unable to coordinate in any meaningful way. The report said everything was under control. But Erik had survived the Holocaust. He knew what resistance looked like when it was still too weak to be visible, knew it in his bones, in the part of himself that had learned to read the signs of danger before the danger had fully materialized. And the signs in these reports were telling him something the reports themselves were not saying. The resistance was not contained. It was growing. It was learning. And it would, if left unchecked, become something that could not be managed with soft enforcement and quiet preference. He closed the folder, set it aside, stared at the window and the view beyond it, the city, the kingdom, the world that he had built and that was now, apparently, beginning to resist him. The tiredness in his bones felt heavier than it had a moment ago. He would deal with it. He always dealt with things. That was what made him Erik Lehnsherr, and that was what made the world his. He reached for his coffee, cold now, and drank it anyway. Chapter 2: The Council. The Mutant Council met every third week in the chamber Erik had built beneath the Genoshan capital. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with seats arranged in concentric rings like a theater, and the design was deliberate. Every member of the council sat at the same level, no one elevated above the others, the architecture itself making the statement that power here was distributed rather than concentrated. The statement was a lie, of course. Power was concentrated. It had always been concentrated in Erik, in the man who had built the council as a tool for governance and maintained it as a tool for legitimacy. The council existed because Erik needed somewhere to direct the work of administration, somewhere to park the ambitions of mutants who might otherwise become problems, somewhere to hold the appearance of a government without surrendering any of the control that made him the government. But the lie was useful, and Erik had learned long ago that useful lies were worth telling. The 12 council members arrived in order of seniority, a hierarchy that Erik had established, and that none of them questioned, because the questioning would have implied that the hierarchy could be challenged, and no one was ready to challenge Erik Lehnsherr in anything. They took their seats, arranged their materials, exchanged the quiet pleasantries of people who had learned to treat each other as colleagues rather than competitors, though the competition never fully disappeared. The council was a body of ambitious mutants, and ambition was a trait that did not disappear simply because a convenient fiction had been established about collegiality. Erik arrived last. He always arrived last. It was a small demonstration of power, the statement that he would come when he was ready and that the council's time was his to command. He walked to the central platform, turned to face the assembled members, and waited for the room to settle into the particular quality of silence that preceded his speaking. No one talked while Erik Lehnsherr was preparing to speak. That was one of the rules of the council, unspoken but absolute. "Raven," Erik said, "report." Mystique rose from her seat. She was at his right hand, had been at his right hand for decades, through wars and truces and the endless negotiation of power that had defined their relationship since the days when both of them were young and certain that the world could be remade according to their designs. She was useful in ways that were difficult to quantify. She saw things as they were rather than as she wished them to be, and in a room full of mutants who had spent their lives dreaming of power, that pragmatism was worth more than loyalty. "Report from the Eastern Territories," Mystique said. She did not look at her tablet. She had read the reports so many times they had become part of her memory, facts arranged in patterns that she could recite without reference. Human unrest in what used to be Japan, small cells, disorganized but coordinated enough to be a concern. They're recruiting. Recruiting what? Erik asked. His voice was flat, not dismissive, interested. He had survived the Holocaust. He knew what resistance looked like when it was still forming, still finding its shape, still too weak to be dangerous but not too weak to be watched. Loyalty cells, Mystique corrected. People who lost family members during the transition, workers who were reassigned to less desirable sectors, parents whose children were placed in mutant education tracks instead of the tracks they preferred. Nothing organized enough to be a threat, but enough to be a problem. And you're telling me this because the cells are growing, because they're learning from each other, sharing tactics, identifying vulnerabilities, building the kind of network that takes time to build but becomes very difficult to dismantle once it's complete. And because, she paused, Erik waited. Because I believe they're receiving support from outside the territories, anonymous support, financial, logistical, perhaps even operational. Someone is helping them organize. The room was very quiet. Someone, Erik said. The word hung in the air, a question and an accusation both. Someone within my domain. Unknown. The financial trails are clean, professional, in fact. Whoever is supporting them knows how to move money without leaving traces. But the support exists, and without it, the cells would not be able to sustain the level of activity we're seeing. Erik absorbed this. The information was not alarming, not yet, but it was significant. A resistance that was receiving external support was a resistance that was not just surviving but growing, and growing resistances required different solutions than stagnant ones. Define the problem, he said, in terms of action required. Mystique looked at him. Her expression was neutral. The face she wore in council sessions was always neutral, a professional mask that revealed nothing of what she actually thought or felt. But Erik had known her too long to be fooled by masks. He saw the calculation behind her eyes, the weighing of options that she had performed before arriving and was now performing again, in real time, as she decided how much to say. The problem is a movement that will, if left unaddressed, become a threat to the stability we've maintained for 3 years. The threat is not immediate. They don't have the capability to challenge us directly, and they know it. But they're building something. Infrastructure. Communication networks. A shared sense of purpose that will, eventually, translate into coordinated action. And the solution? That's what I'm here to ask you. Erik was silent for a moment. Around him, the council members watched, some with interest, some with concern, some with the particular quality of attention that came from wanting to see how he would respond to a challenge to his authority. He felt their eyes the way he always felt them, as a weight, a pressure, a reminder that even in a room full of mutants who owed their positions to him, the possibility of betrayal was never fully absent. Disappear the leaders, he said quietly. Not publicly, not dramatically. Make it quiet. Make it look natural, heart attacks, car accidents, the kind of deaths that don't inspire questions. Fragment the cells by reassigning their members to different regions, different work sectors. Break the network before it can solidify. Mystique nodded slowly, and the external support. Trace it, find it. If it leads somewhere inside my domain, find who is providing it and determine whether they are a threat or simply an inconvenience. If they are a threat, eliminate them. If they are an inconvenience, neutralize them. And if the trail leads outside the domain. Erik looked at her. Then we follow it, and we find out who is foolish enough to support resistance against my rule, and then we decide what kind of response is appropriate. The room was quiet. Mystique returned to her seat. The other council members shuffled their papers, exchanged glances, prepared themselves for whatever would come next. The meeting continued. Other reports, other concerns, the routine machinery of governance, turning as it always turned, grinding through the issues that required attention and setting aside the ones that could wait. Erik listened, commented when necessary, made decisions when decisions were required, and watched the council members as they performed their roles, ambitious mutants pretending to be colleagues, rivals pretending to be partners, enemies pretending to be allies. He had built this, all of it. The council, the chamber, the elaborate fiction of shared governance that allowed him to maintain absolute control while appearing to share power. He had built it because he understood that power was not just about what you could force people to do. It was about what you could make people believe was inevitable. And the belief he had cultivated over 3 years of careful management was that the world he had built was the only world that was possible, that the peace he had established was the only peace that could last. That resistance was not just futile but absurd, a denial of the obvious truth that mutants were simply better suited to lead than humans, and that accepting this truth was the price of survival in a universe that no longer apologized for what it was. The belief was propaganda, of course. Erik knew that. The truth was more complicated, messier, more uncertain, less susceptible to the clean narratives that made propaganda effective. But the belief served its purpose, and purpose was what mattered. The purpose was order. The purpose was stability. The purpose was a world where the children of mutants would never know what it felt like to be hunted, never understand the fear that had defined Erik's childhood, never learn that the people around them saw them as anything other than normal. He would do whatever was necessary to maintain that purpose. He had always known that. The only question was whether the doing would eventually cost more than the purpose was worth. He pushed the thought aside. It was not a useful thought, and Erik had learned in 80 years of survival to set aside thoughts that were not useful. The meeting ended. The council members filed out, returning to their duties, their territories, their small fiefdoms within his larger domain. Erik remained on the platform, watching them go, and when the chamber was empty except for him and Mystique, he turned to face her. "You think I'm wrong," he said. It was not a question. Mystique stood by the doorway, her posture relaxed, her face still wearing the neutral mask of the council session. But her eyes were different. Her eyes were always different. They saw things that masks could not hide. "I think you're doing what you've always done," she said. "Solving problems with the tools that have always worked for you, and I think those tools are becoming less effective as the world changes around them." "The world doesn't change, people change, and people can be managed." "Can they?" Mystique walked toward him, her footsteps echoing in the empty chamber. "You managed Charles for decades. You managed the XMen. You managed the governments of the world, at least for a while. But you're not managing this, you're just containing it. And containing something only works until the pressure gets too high and the container breaks." Erik said nothing. "I'm not saying you're wrong to be concerned," Mystique continued. "The resistance is real. The external support is real. The threat, if it continues to grow, is real. But the solution you've chosen, disappear the leaders, fragment the cells, trace the support, and eliminate it, that's the solution you've always used. And it always works. Until it doesn't. When did you become a philosopher? About 30 years ago. You just didn't notice because you were busy being a tyrant." Erik almost smiled. Almost. The impulse was there, the recognition of the old rhythm between them, the barbed exchange, the challenge and counter-challenge, the constant negotiation of two people who had known each other too long to pretend they didn't know exactly what the other was thinking. "I'm doing what needs to be done," he said. "The same thing I've always done. The same thing you would do if you were in my position." "I know," Mystique said. "That's what worries me." She left. Erik watched her go, and something cold settled in his chest. Not fear exactly, but a distant cousin of fear. The recognition that even his most trusted lieutenant was beginning to doubt, beginning to question, beginning to wonder whether the world he had built was as stable as it appeared. Doubt was dangerous. Doubt spread. Doubt was the first crack in a structure that had to remain unbroken if the world was to continue functioning as he intended. He would deal with it. He always dealt with things. He left the chamber, walked through the corridors of the palace, climbed the stairs to the study that had been Charles's and was now his. The medallion hung against his chest, cool against his skin, a reminder of what he had promised and what he intended to keep. For those who came after. He sat at the desk, picked up a pen, began to write. The resistance would be addressed. The external support would be traced. The leaders would be made to disappear, and the cells would fragment, and the world would continue as it had continued, ordered, stable, safe. And if the tools he used were the same tools he had always used, if the solution was the same solution that had always worked, then that was not a sign of failure. It was a sign of consistency. It was a sign that Erik Lehnsherr knew what he was doing, and that knowing what you were doing was the only thing that had ever kept the world from falling apart. He wrote until the sun went down. Then he set aside the pen, stood, walked to the window, and watched the city lights come on. One by one, then thousands, then millions. A galaxy of illumination that represented everything he had built and everything he intended to preserve. The tiredness in his bones did not fade. But he had learned long ago not to let tiredness stop him. Chapter 3: The Quiet War. Remy LeBeau had been many things in his life: a thief, an assassin, a member of the Thieves' Guild, a member of the XMen, a member of nothing at all, a man who belonged nowhere and everywhere at once, a half-breed caught between the worlds that had made him and the worlds that had rejected him. He had spent years trying to find a place where his particular brand of darkness could coexist with something resembling a conscience, and he had failed at every turn. The Thieves' Guild wanted his skills but not his scruples. The X-Men wanted his scruples but not his skills. The world at large wanted neither, and gave him nothing in return except the constant, grinding awareness that he was not enough, not mutant enough for the Brotherhood, not human enough for the humans, not good enough for the good guys, not bad enough for the bad guys. Until now, until Magneto. It was not that Remy had become a believer. He had seen too much to believe in anything as simple as a single man's vision, no matter how compelling that man might be. Magneto was a tyrant, a well-intentioned tyrant perhaps, a tyrant with a history of suffering that explained and even justified much of what he had done, but a tyrant nonetheless. Remy did not need to believe in Magneto's vision to recognize what the vision had accomplished. A world where mutants were safe and humans were managed, where the hierarchy was clear and the peace was enforced, where the kind of persecution that had defined mutant existence for generations had been replaced by something that was not persecution, but was also not freedom. Remy could live in that world. He was living in it, had been living in it for 3 years, had found a place within its structures that was comfortable enough, not satisfying, but comfortable, a niche where his particular talents could be exercised without requiring him to pretend that he believed in anything larger than his own survival. But Magneto had made it personal. It was not the big things that made it personal, not the laws, not the enforcement, not the dramatic acts of power that made headlines and shaped the narrative of the new order. It was the small things, the accumulated weight of 1,000 small indignities, each one trivial in isolation, all of them together forming a pattern that Remy recognized because he had lived it his whole life. A restaurant in what used to be New Orleans, run by a human family he had known since he was a boy, suddenly found itself denied a permit renewal for reasons no one could quite explain. A friend, a human friend, one of the few he had ever trusted, was quietly reassigned to a work sector far from his home, his family, his life. A child he had seen playing in the streets was transferred to a mutant education track, not because of her abilities but because of her genetics, and her parents were told, with professional courtesy, that the transfer was in her best interest and could not be reversed. It was preference, tendency, the natural consequence of a system that valued one group over another, and Remy, who had spent his whole life being half of something, half mutant, half human, half this, half that, understood exactly what it felt like to be on the wrong side of a preference that was not quite discrimination, but was also not quite anything else. One night, in a bar in a city that used to be called Bogota and now answered to Magneto's council, Remy sat across from a woman who had been a mutant rights lawyer before Magneto's ascension. She was human. She was also brilliant, exhausted, and carrying the particular despair of someone who had spent years fighting a system that had just finished winning. "The courts don't help anymore," she said. Her voice was flat, not defeated exactly, but tired in a way that went deeper than fatigue. "I used to be able to argue cases, make arguments, get things changed. Now the arguments don't matter. The The judges are mutants, or they're humans who understand which way the wind is blowing, and the law is whatever Magneto needs it to be on any given day. So you stopped practicing. I stopped believing it would make a difference. There's a difference. Remy turned a playing card between his fingers. The card caught the light, red and gold, the colors of his guild, the colors of everything he had been before he became nothing at all. He had always liked cards. They were honest in their way. You knew what they were. You knew what they could do. We can't fight him, she continued. Not directly. We don't have the power. The enforcers are everywhere. The council controls everything, and anyone who gets too loud gets disappeared into one of those reassignment programs that nobody ever comes back from. Power ain't the only way, Remy said. His voice was quiet, not confident, not certain, just quiet. The voice of a man who had spent his whole life on the margins of things, who had learned that the loudest voices in any room were usually the least interesting ones. Every empire falls eventually, even the big ones, even the ones that seem permanent. You're talking about waiting generations. I'm talking about starting something. He laid the card on the table, Ace of Hearts, a beginning. Not an army, he continued. Not a revolution, maybe not ever, but a network. People who remember what the old world smelled like. People who know how to move through the cracks. People who are willing to wait. She looked at the card, then at him. You want to build a resistance. I want to build a remembrance. A little ember somewhere that nobody can find. Someday it catches. Someday it burns. But first someone has to start sparking. And you're doing this because... Remy smiled. It was his most charming expression, and also his most honest. The smile of a man who had learned to be charming because charm was the only thing he had, and who had also learned that charm could be truth if you were careful enough about when you used it. Because I spent my whole life on one foot or another. The thieves, the XMen, never belonged anywhere. And I realized that's the problem. That's the whole problem. We never belonged anywhere. Not human enough for humans, not mutant enough for mutants, not good enough for the good guys, not bad enough for the bad guys. He took the card back, slipped it into his deck, let the motion become a kind of meditation, the familiar weight of the cards, the muscle memory of years of practice, the thing that had always been true about him even when nothing else was. But this, he said, this is mine, this is ours. We make something because we decide it's worth macking. Not because anyone told us to, not because we're supposed to, just because we remember what it felt like to have a choice. She extended her hand. What's it called? Remy took her hand and shook it. Her grip was firm, the grip of someone who had spent years fighting and was not ready to stop. We ain't named it yet, he said, but we will. The resistance did not begin with a declaration. It began with a card and a handshake and a woman who had been a lawyer and was now something else, something less defined, more dangerous, more necessary. The name came later. Remy chose it himself after months of searching for something that felt right, something that captured the philosophy he had articulated in that bar in Bogota. The name was simple, deceptive, the kind of name that could be forgotten, dismissed, ignored, and that was the point. The Remnant. The name was deliberate, not a rebellion, not a revolution. A remnant, the part that remains when the rest has been consumed. It implied survival rather than victory. It implied patience rather than aggression. It was a name designed to endure, not to conquer. Remy recruited with the same patience. He did not want soldiers. He had seen what soldiers did, how they fought and died and accomplished nothing except the perpetuation of conflict. He wanted ghosts. People who could disappear into the new world without being noticed, who could operate in the margins and the cracks, who could hold an address in their head and never write it down. People who understood that the most dangerous thing in the world was not power but time, not the strength to strike but the willingness to wait. He found them in abandoned communities, in dismissed workforces, in the overflow of institutions that had been quietly cleared of human leadership. He found them in the families of mutants who had been imprisoned for speaking against Magneto's council, not the mutants themselves, but their children, their siblings, their friends, people who remembered what had been taken and were willing to do whatever was necessary to ensure it was never taken again. He found them in human communities that had lost their children to Magneto's mutant-first education programs. Not taken, not stolen, just redirected, their brightest minds trained to serve a system that would never fully serve them in return. Parents who had watched their sons and daughters become something other than what they had been raised to be. Parents who had accepted the new world because they had no choice, and who remembered in the quiet hours of the night that acceptance was not the same as agreement. The Remnant's first cell was 7 people. Remy, the lawyer, and 5 others, 5 ghosts who had agreed to build something without knowing what it would become, who had trusted a half-breed thief with their lives and their futures, because he was the only one who had offered them a choice. Within 2 years, it was 70. Within 5, it was a network spanning 3 continents, connected by dead drops and coded messages, and the kind of trust that could only be built in silence. And Remy, who had never been a leader, who had spent his whole life avoiding responsibility, found that he was good at this. Not because he was wise or noble or strategic, though he was all 3 in his way, but because he understood something that Charles Xavier and Magneto both failed to grasp. People didn't want to be saved. They wanted to be given a chance to save themselves. Charles had believed in saving people, in pulling them out of their difficulties, elevating them above their circumstances, showing them the better path and expecting them to follow it. It was a generous vision, an idealistic vision, the vision of a man who had never been desperate enough to understand that desperation was its own kind of knowledge. Magneto had believed in forcing people to be saved, in building a world so secure that they had no choice but to accept safety, even if the safety came with chains. It was an effective vision, a pragmatic vision, the vision of a man who had been desperate and had survived and could not imagine any other way. Remy believed in neither. Remy believed in offering, in putting something in front of people, not salvation, not safety, but a possibility, and letting them decide whether to take it. The Remnant was not an army. It was not a salvation. It was a door left open for anyone who was willing to walk through it. That was the philosophy that built the Remnant. That was the philosophy that kept it alive. And it was that philosophy, patient, humble, resilient, that would eventually draw the attention of someone the Remnant desperately needed. Chapter 4: The Network Grows. The years accumulated like snow, silent, gradual, transforming the landscape without anyone noticing the transformation, until one day they looked around and realized that the world had changed. Remy grew older. Not old, not yet, but older. The silver in his hair spread, the lines around his eyes deepened. The easy grace of his youth gave way to something more deliberate, more controlled. The movement of a man who had learned that every gesture had consequences and who had therefore learned to make his gestures count. The Remnant grew too. Not just in numbers. Numbers were the least interesting measure of growth, but in capability, in reach, in the quiet, invisible architecture of a network that had become, over time, something more than the sum of its parts. The cells proliferated, each one autonomous, each one connected to the others through channels that Remy had designed, and that no one else fully understood. The communications protocols evolved, becoming more sophisticated, harder to trace, more resistant to the surveillance systems that Magneto's enforcers deployed across the domain. And the philosophy remained. That was the part that mattered. People don't want to be saved. They want to be given a chance to save themselves. Remy repeated the principle to himself every morning, as a kind of meditation, a reminder of why he was doing what he was doing. He had seen too many movements collapse under the weight of their own ambition, too many revolutions that started as liberations and ended as new forms of oppression, too many saviors who became tyrants because they forgot that the people they were saving were not objects to be saved, but subjects with their own agency, their own desires, their own understanding of what freedom actually meant. The Remnant would not make that mistake, could not afford to make it, because the Remnant was not about Magneto, was not even about the humans who had lost their positions, or the mutants who had been imprisoned for speaking out, or any of the individual grievances that had driven people to join. The Remnant was about the idea, the possibility, the ember that could, someday, catch fire. Remy protected the idea the way he had once protected the most valuable cards in his deck, with care, with attention, with the understanding that what was protected was more important than who was doing the protecting. The Fantastic Four had refused to help. Remy had approached them because he needed resources, weapons, information, sanctuary. The Remnant was growing faster than it was stabilizing, and there were gaps in its capabilities that no amount of street-level recruitment could fill. The Fantastic Four had what he needed: technology, training, the kind of institutional support that could transform a loose network into something more structured, more effective, more capable of surviving the inevitable crackdown that would come when Magneto decided the Remnant was too large to ignore. But the Fantastic Four had said no. Reed Richards had said it with regret, had explained at length the calculations that had led him to conclude that direct opposition to Magneto's regime was not strategically viable. The Fantastic Four were too visible, too easily targeted, too dependent on the infrastructure that Magneto controlled. Challenging him openly would mean destruction, not just for them, but for everyone they were trying to protect. Sue Storm had said it with frustration, had argued in the meeting that the Remnant was exactly the kind of movement that needed institutional support, that the Fantastic Four had a responsibility to provide that support, that refusing to help was itself a choice to accept Magneto's world rather than fight for something different. Ben Grimm had said it with a grunt and a muttered curse, which was more or less what Ben always said when the conversation turned to things he didn't want to think about. And Johnny Storm had said nothing at all. Remy had noticed that, had filed it away the way he filed everything: observation, pattern, the slow accumulation of knowledge about the people around him. Johnny Storm was 26 years old and had spent his entire superhero career being underestimated, dismissed, treated as the least serious member of a team that included a genius, a woman with invisible force fields, and a rock creature with a heart of gold. He was the youngest, the loudest, the most reckless, the one who charged in before thinking because thinking was what Reed did, and Johnny was not Reed. But there was something else, something Remy had seen in the way Johnny watched the conversation, listened to the arguments, processed the refusal, not agreement, not disagreement, something else. Fire, maybe, the kind that didn't show itself until it had already burned through everything around it. Remy did not push. He took the no and moved on, because that was what the Remnant did: adapted, adjusted, found other paths when the obvious path was blocked. He left the Baxter building with contact information for a few quiet supporters, resources that could be accessed without visibility, the beginning of a relationship that might someday become something more. He did not know then that he was leaving behind the spark that would change everything. The Remnant's expansion was not random. Remy had designed the network with specific principles in mind: redundancy, compartmentalization, the elimination of single points of failure. No cell knew the identities of more than 3 other cells. No individual knew more than was necessary for their specific function. The information flowed in patterns that appeared chaotic from the outside, but were, from the inside, as precise as the movement of cards in a skilled dealer's hands. The recruitment followed the same patterns. Each new member was vetted through channels that Remy had established, tested for loyalty not to the Remnant but to the idea of the Remnant, the philosophy, the purpose, the willingness to wait rather than strike. People who wanted to fight were turned away. People who wanted to avenge were redirected. People who wanted to save, to be heroes, to make speeches, to change the world in a single dramatic action, were sent away with gentle words and the reminder that the ember had to catch before it could burn. But sometimes, rarely, carefully, with the kind of attention that Remy gave to everything that mattered, he found someone who understood, someone who could wait without losing their fire, someone who could carry the weight of patience without being crushed by it. Kurt Wagner was one of those people. Kurt had been many things: a circus performer, a Catholic boy, an X-Man, a priest, a pirate. The story was long and involved, and Kurt told it rarely, and finally, a member of the Remnant. He was charming, empathetic, genuinely believed in the philosophy that Remy had articulated. And most importantly, he had the kind of faith that could sustain a person through years of quiet resistance without burning out or giving up. Remy trusted him. Not completely. Remy had learned in his years of living in the margins that complete trust was a luxury that could not be afforded, but more than he trusted most people. Kurt had a quality that was rare in the world Magneto had built: sincerity. He believed what he said. He meant what he did. He was, in the deepest sense of the word, good, not naive, not soft, not unprepared for the realities of the world they were living in, but good in the way that people were good when they had decided, consciously, to be good, and then spent every day of their lives honoring that decision. They worked together for 3 years, built the network, recruited cells, designed protocols. Remy taught Kurt everything he knew, and Kurt absorbed it with the attentiveness of a man who had spent his whole life learning from the circus, from the church, from Charles Xavier, from everyone who had ever had something to teach him. And Kurt, in turn, taught Remy things he had not known he needed to learn: about faith, about patience, about the importance of believing in something larger than yourself, even when that something was invisible, even when the evidence suggested that believing in it was foolish. "The ember will catch," Kurt said one night, in a safe house in what used to be Berlin. They were both tired, the work was always exhausting, and exhaustion accumulated over years until it became something that was always there, a background hum of fatigue that never fully disappeared. "I've seen it before. In the church, when I was young, the way faith spreads, not through force but through example. One person believes, then another, and eventually the belief becomes so strong that it doesn't need to be defended. It just is." "You sound like Charles," Remy said, not unkindly. He had known Charles, had respected him in his way, and the comparison was not an insult. "I learned from him. We all did." Kurt's blue eyes were serious, always serious, in the moments that mattered, even though the rest of his face could be playful, charming, animated in a way that made people forget how much darkness he had seen. "But Charles believed in saving people. I believe in what you believe in, giving them the chance to save themselves. The difference is small, but it's everything." Remy looked at him. This man who had been an X-Man, who had fought against Magneto, who had lost his mentor and his family and his entire world, and was now here, in this safe house, working to build something that might never catch fire, that might burn for a generation and then die, that might never accomplish anything except the stubborn insistence that another way was possible. "Why are you here?" Remy asked. It was not a question he usually asked. He had learned long ago that people's reasons for joining were their own business, and that digging too deep could damage the trust that held networks together. But Kurt was different. Kurt was someone he wanted to understand. Kurt was quiet for a moment. The safe house was silent except for the hum of the city outside, distant traffic, muffled voices, the sound of a world that had learned to live under Magneto's rule and had, mostly, stopped dreaming of anything else. "Because I watched Charles die," Kurt said finally, "and I watched Erik stand over him, and I saw something in Erik's face that I hadn't seen before. Not triumph, not satisfaction, loss. The kind of loss that breaks a person, even when they're too strong to admit they're broken." Remy said nothing. "Charles believed in saving people," Kurt continued. "Erik believed in forcing them to be saved. And they both died, not literally, not Erik, but Charles did, believing they were right. And I stood there in the wreckage of everything we had built together, and I thought, there's got to be another way. Not saving, not forcing, just opening a door, letting people choose. That's what the Remnant is. I know, that's why I'm here." Remy nodded slowly. The conversation had touched something, some recognition, some resonance, the sense of two people who had arrived at similar conclusions through very different paths. He had not expected to find that kind of understanding in Kurt Wagner. He had not expected to find it anywhere. But he had learned, in his years of building the Remnant, that understanding was the most valuable thing in the world. More valuable than weapons, more valuable than information, more valuable than any of the concrete resources that the Remnant needed to survive. Understanding was what held networks together. Understanding was what turned collections of individuals into something that could last. "I'll make you a cell leader," Remy said. "If you want it, you'd be good at it." Kurt smiled, not the charming smile, not the playful smile, but the smile of a man who had been offered something he had been hoping for and was too wise to show how much it meant to him. "I want it," he said. "Thank you." Remy stood, stretched, walked to the window. The city was dark. Magneto had implemented light restrictions in residential areas to conserve energy, or so the official explanation went, though everyone knew the real reason was control, visibility, the ability to see who was moving through the streets when they should have been home. Somewhere out there the remnant was growing, cells multiplying, embers catching. And Remy, who had never belonged anywhere, who had spent his whole life searching for a place that would accept him, began to feel something he had not felt in a very long time. Home,